Hello guys and welcome to our class for today. I am going to start just by going to the lesson plan. This is class 28. We're going to talk about government intervention. We're going to talk about how the government intervenes in response to externalities. We're not going to get to common pool resources today. We'll talk about that in the next class. We'll briefly talk about what government does in response to externalities and also the strength and limit of their government policies. I recommend you look at these videos here as well. We'll talk about these two things and we'll continue these here on the next day. So I'm going to use cognitively as the reference. Remember, big picture here, we're talking about market failure. Market failure, one example we looked at the last day, water pollution. But essentially, market failure is when we have any of these, for example, any of these three things. We produce too much because we don't take into account the cost of pollution. We consume too much because we don't take into account that our private benefit actually takes away from the benefit of society. And then here in general, when we overconsume and produce. So one of the reasons why markets fail is because of externalities. And we'll look at, and when markets fail, this is, in microeconomics, this is a reason for governments to intervene. Basically, who can fix the problem with the failing markets? It's up to the governments. And we'll just talk briefly about the options that the government can use. And in terms of these options, the easiest to analyze in diagrams is taxes. So basically, if there's if we're consuming too much of a good or producing too much of a good, the government just puts a tax on the producer, and this causes the supply curve to shift to the left. Or if it's something they want them to consume more of, they can give a subsidy and make the supply curve shift to the right. Briefly speaking, so when we talk, I'm just going to be like, there's a very diagram focused, and you guys can read the cognitively for more detail. But basically, when we talk about market failures, anytime we don't achieve this point B. What is point B? It's when supply is equal to demand, and our true supply equals demand. So when supply is equal to the MSC, the marginal social cost. So the supply curve truly reflects the cost to society, and the demand curve truly reflects the benefit to society. Now, the last day we showed diagrams where if we were on the wrong demand, the wrong supply curve, what would happen in equilibrium? And we'd under or over consume. We wouldn't have allocated efficiency. When we talk about market failure, we are talking about whenever we don't get allocated efficiency, essentially whenever we don't end up at this point B, when these two are equal. So some of your definitions there, externalities. There's four, essentially externalities, the definition, they can result either from the consumption or production of goods and services, and they can create a gap between the marginal private cost and the marginal social cost, or on the benefits as well. So, for example, negative externality of production. We cause pollution. A lot of the steel factories cause pollution when they produce. The marginal private cost is the cost of producing the steel. The marginal social cost is this cost plus the pollution. The positive externalities of production, we'll look at the example I used from beekeeping. Bees produce a positive externality to the rest of society. That's what makes their private social cost, their marginal social cost lower than the marginal private cost. And then we'll talk about these ones here as well, briefly. First, merit goods. Merit good is something like education. It's underprovided because us as consumers, we do not appreciate the benefits to ourselves and society. So here it's not just that the fact that there's an externality, so we don't actually appreciate the benefits to ourselves. So when we're young, we get this great education, we don't want to go to school, but it's actually benefits us a lot in the long term. So merit goods is when it's a private good. So we'll talk about the distinction between private and public goods later, but it's a private good that is underproduced because we demand too little of it. We don't fully take into account the benefit we're getting to. more definitions down there. And then demerit goods is things like alcohol, drugs, cigarettes, etc. When people consume these goods for initial enjoyment, but they might consume too much. They don't take into account the negative impacts these things have on their body, and they don't on their mind as well. And then they don't take into account the fact that this would have negative consequences for society. Because what happens when you get lots of people drunk, they might start fighting and so on. Negative externalities of production. So we're now on section 2.8.2. What I'm going to do here is show you how the diagram works. I'm going to show you what happens when how we can do something about this. So it's like, what can the government do about this? So negative externality of production. This essentially, and this is all the detail, when the marginal social cost of production is greater than the private cost of production, firms don't take into account the extra costs. So very quickly on the diagram, and guys, these diagrams are really important. A lot of you might be doing an internal assessment, an IA on something like this. So looking at when a company is overproducing because they don't take into account the social cost. So what's happening here? And the interesting part is this triangle. So let's get to explaining that. So I'm going to explain this graph in some detail, and then the other externality diagrams, I'm going to just briefly explain them. So as usual, price on this axis, quantity on this axis. If we have allocative efficiency in this market, it's where MSB is equal to MSC at point A. So if all the firms who are producing the steel are aware of the social cost and the pollution, they will produce at a level Q1, and we will have this equilibrium here. But they're not. They believe they're on this cost curve. Well, they act like they're on this cost curve because they only take into account their private costs. They don't take into account the production. So they act like they're, not that they're on this private cost curve, and they end up producing Q2 in equilibrium. Now, if these firms were good social citizens, they would act like they're on this curve here, and we would produce a point A. So we all know that for higher costs, we have a higher supply, a supply curve to the left. So the true supply curve for this market is to the left. We should end up then at Q1. So what is this welfare loss? Well, Q1 and Q2, this is the overproduction between Q1 and Q2. Why is it overproduction? Well, notice for all the output between these levels here, the marginal cost, the social cost, is higher than the social benefit. So because we are using this as our supply curve, the steel firms are producing this much quantity where the cost to society is above the benefit. And this is what the welfare loss is. Okay, next then, what do we do about it? So you can read all these different things here. The different things, government has a few options. They can put a tax, that's the one we're going to analyze here. They could make some legislation, ban, production, or limit the amount of production, or else they could have these tradable emission permits. We'll talk about these the next day. But here, looking at if they put a tax. So we know if you put a tax on a supply curve, it's going to cause the supply curve to shift to the left. So this is essentially what these guys are trying to do. They're trying to get rid of this welfare loss, the government. So they put a tax, and you notice is the bigger the tax they put on, eventually, if they put a big enough tax, they get back to this level here. So I just want to highlight some of the challenges here. The challenge of picking the tax, first you have to pick a tax, or first you need to know the exact size of the welfare loss. And you need to know how much we're overproducing. And then you pick your tax accordingly. So it's not very easy to pick the tax. But the mechanics are the best, a possible response for the government in this situation, if they want to get rid of this welfare loss, they can just put a tax. So you notice for any positive tax, we reduce the welfare loss. And if this government is very, very smart and they're able to work out exactly how much the overproduction, exactly how much the welfare loss is, then they can completely get rid of the welfare loss, but not easy. And we'll talk about that on the evaluation. So here we talk about what we do on the evaluation, and then the benefits of the solution. For taxes, the benefits are one. I mean, taxes are easier to apply than other more sophisticated measures like these tradable emission permits, which we'll talk more about the next day. So they're relatively straightforward to apply. So basically, a benefit always for tax is simple to implement. And then the second thing here, tax revenues can be invested in promoting innovation and new technologies. So basically, you earn a revenue, you can use that for investing in something else. The problems for tax, it's relatively easy to apply a tax, but to get the exact right tax, it's not that difficult. Remember, look at how the supply curve went. If you put too small a tax, you'd still have a welfare loss. If you put too big a tax, then you have the other problem. You tax the producers so much that you're actually underproducing. That's not good either. Second point there, it's also difficult to identify which firms are polluting and to what extent each firm is responsible for the pollution. So yeah, do you just put one tax on every single firm? What about if some firms were actually had really good, healthy production processes? Do you punish them all equally? That's the challenge. And then taxes make firms pay for the pollution, but they don't actually stop the pollution. So you're getting them to pay for the pollution, there's still pollution there. So you're not really getting rid of the pollution. Remember, you're still producing at a different output. You're still producing at Q star. There's still some pollution here for these ones that are produced. Only now the firms are paying for it. So this is your challenge as an economist. You have to not only identify what's the problem, you need to identify what's a potential solution, and then you need to evaluate what will work about this solution, what will not work about this solution. We talked about it a lot in class for things like cigarette smoking. We also came up with our new idea, the good intention and the potential negative consequence. So I asked you guys to think about lots of different policies. What would the good intention of this policy be? So banning meat in state employees 2 days a week. Good intention, we cut our meat consumption. What if the bad consequence is that, well, people just start going to McDonald's and we get healthier or less healthy and more obese. Legislation, I will talk about this again, and the tradable emission permits are a bit more complex. We'll talk about those again another day. Positive externalities of production. So not all production produces just pollution. Here we talk about the example of beekeeping. Please read through this here, understand what they're talking about. But in this case, the marginal social cost of production is smaller than the marginal private cost. So we have the opposite challenge. Here, we have the marginal social cost is actually less. So this curve, the supply curve, is to the right of the private cost curve. So in this case, it's not that we have a welfare loss, but we're actually leaving behind a potential welfare gain. So what happens here? In equilibrium, we produce a Q2. The beekeepers will take into account their private cost, and here's the social benefit. But if they produced Q1 is the point A here, where the social cost and social benefit intersect. Now, Q1, what's the difference in Q1 and Q2? Here, this additional output. Notice that between Q1 and Q2, the social benefit is still above the social cost. So basically, it's in the interest of society for us to reduce between Q2 and Q1, because the social benefit is above the social cost for this level of production. So this area, this triangle here, is a potential welfare gain if we produce at the right level. So it's like we're underproducing here because we don't take into account the externality. What can a government do about it? Well, if you tax when you overproduce, it's kind of the opposite. If you underproduce, you subsidize. So for here, you want to get this curve down to this one here. So you just subsidize and you estimate what you think the welfare gain is, you estimate how much you think the underproduction, and then you put a subsidy. And then when you put a subsidy, you shift this curve to the right. And it's the same challenges as before. So again, for subsidies, some will oh, sorry, that's the directory. So for subsidies, I mean, problems with this, it's difficult to estimate the level of subsidy deserved by every firm. So some beekeepers might be just really bad at it and very wasteful. Do we give them subsidies? Each subsidy uses government funds and it has a cost. So this is very important when you're talking about subsidies. It has a direct cost. The government has to pay money out. So it's not for free. But then every time you use this money, it's an opportunity cost. You could have been using it for something else. So should we be using the government money on subsidizing beekeepers, or should we be getting more hospital beds? Should we be getting better facilities in schools? That's the challenge. So we have a lot of good ideas competing for the same funds. When we pick one, we don't pick the other. There's an opportunity cost. Okay, and then the last one here we'll talk about is a negative externality of consumption. Car congestion is one. We talk about, so basically everyone driving the car to work. But have a read of this section here, and this one is we have an overconsumption because each person, when you're driving to work, you don't take into account the pollution you're causing. You only take into account your own private benefit. You get here quicker, etc. You're willing to pay more for driving than a train. So the MPB is above the marginal social benefit, because if you took into account the benefit to society, you would not have this high of a demand. You'd have a lower demand. So what happens in equilibrium? Well, again, it's where MPB and MSC intersect. It's at this point here. We will, as a society, we will have this much cars driving each month at Q2. If we took into account the full social cost, it would be Q1. And again, the same thing, why is this difference between Q2 and Q1 a problem? Well, because between Q2 and Q1, the social cost is higher than the social benefit. And all this area here is a deadweight loss. It's trickier in this case here. What do we do? How do we get rid of it? Well, remember, the taxes and subsidies, they get put on the producer. So it's going to be a little bit trickier here. We don't just put taxes on the consumers. We put them on the producers. So you'll see it's a little bit trickier here. So some of the solutions. So some of the solutions given, you can ban or regulate the goods. So this is the exact same for these analysis of cars. It's the exact same analysis of cars as it is for cigarette smoking. You could ban or regulate the good, you could impose their indirect tax, or you could have negative advertising. You could ban or regulate the good, so you ban cars, I mean, yeah, people go crazy, ban cigarettes, you could have a black market. Imposing indirect tax, if you impose an indirect tax, it's solution one here. Let's close that. You put a tax, you cause this supply curve to shift up to the up. And your intention is to shift this up to get to this dashed red line until you get the new equilibrium point at Q star. Another alternative, so this is a bit messy to put the two diagrams on together. Remember, you're trying to get rid of this triangle here. If you put this, so you're trying to get us to switch from Q1 to Q star. Another alternative is to negative advertising. So encourage people to not consume this product. So encourage them so in a way that you shift this MPB towards the MSB curve, and you get back to here and get rid of this waste. So again, here we talk about, you can look at the different positive and negatives for each, and we'll talk a bit more about these. Just in terms of definition, putting a tax on the good, whenever if the government could impose an indirect tax on the good itself to increase the private cost of consumption by increasing the price of the good, these indirect taxes are called Pigovian taxes. And then there's a point about the elasticity here as well. Okay, that brings on to 2.84. I won't go through 2.8.5, positive externality consumption. I won't go through that today. I'll make another video on that one there. And then we'll talk about the common pool resources in another video as well. Okay, well, thank you very much for today.